This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This morning we're going to be talking about anxiety, and I want to make a claim here that the anxiety I'm talking about is what we experience as a result of what we have, what you might call learned through life, circumstance, situations, and so on, family, upbringings, all of those things that have given us what I would call learned behaviors. Now, if it's a learned behavior, it also can be unlearned. And that's where we're going to be sort of addressing the bench this morning. What I think I want to emphasize is, though, that in the area of anxiety, when it's a sort of what I would call a DNA item, when it's built into somebody, it's part of their metabolism, their physiology, and so on. That is an area that needs very intense, very sophisticated, comprehensive therapy. And that is naturally not what we're trying to do. That is what you would commonly say is the job for the professional. And
yeah, and
I
so
think,
we're sharing that and putting that caveat out there that we're
absolutely.
speaking of,
Yeah.
of
So if I could put it
external
to,
factors.
yeah, if I could put it to you this way, as much as respectonomics draws on other people's experiences and lives and so on, I would like this particular discussion on anxiety to reflect our authentic experience, what you and I have seen in our lives, how it's affected us, and what techniques we've been treated to that help us to undo the damage and undo the whatever you'd call it, the resistance.
Right.
Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair.
Okay, well then, under the heading of fairness, then, let's look at anxiety. And the first thing we need to do is to identify it. If you look
Yes.
at any problem in the world, and you can apply this in economics and politics anywhere you want, but the problem we always have to do is to identify the problem first. And one of the difficulties with anxiety, if you can't see me holding up my hand, I really am. I'm holding up my hand and my heart, because what I want to emphasize is this. So often in the area of anxiety, we think of it as being a problem. It's actually often a symptom. And the problem underneath it is where we need to be paying attention. So in other words, I show that I'm anxious about something. And by the way, if anybody wants to know whether they are anxious about anything, you see it in a number of different ways. Your heart palpitations is one of them. The tightness in your face. You know that thing when you get uptight and your face gets tight and you can't move it easily? There are symptoms like that that tell us that we are experiencing anxiety. So that's to experience anxiety is, okay. And some of us want to solve anxiety through some fairly interesting techniques. One of them is alcohol. And the problem with alcohol is, as any, well, I would say addiction person will tell you, is that alcohol is a depressant. So in other words, when you have your slosh-o-matics with wine and scotch and whatever, and in actual fact, it draws you down. It doesn't build you up. And if it does build you up, it's a fakery anyway. So again, yeah. So I think it's very important to get to the understanding of why we experience anxiety. And that's part of the identifying process. But identifying.
So what would your definition be of anxiety then?
Well, the definition, I've talked a little about the sort of the physicality of it, the sweaty palms, the palpitations of the heart, tightness in your chest, those kinds of things. I'm not sure, funnily enough, I'm not sure there's a definition for it. I really don't think there is. I think it's something that, who was that high court judge once? He was talking about obscenity, and he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think anxiety falls very much into that same bracket.
Well, I think it can be very individual to people in terms of what they would define as anxiety or a feeling of anxiety for them versus somebody else.
Right. Now, you know how we always resort to Latin and Greek?
We do.
Would you try and look interested just this once, please?
I'm always interested, Jeremy.
Oh, right, Sarah. The word anxiety comes from the Latin ango, which means to throttle.
Hmm.
And that, in effect, has two very interesting dimensions to it, because anxiety does throttle you. You know that feeling when you feel suppressed? You just feel you
Mm-hmm.
can't get at it. I'm so anxious, I can't ABC.
Mm-hmm.
It has a throttling, suffocating kind of.
Can be debilitating.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the word ango fits, throttling fits very well. But the interesting sort of almost a contradiction is, if you have you ever driven a motorbike? Have you ever driven a motorboat? Have you ever had an outboard motor?
I have been on those, but I've not
All right.
driven them. But I know
Okay.
exactly where you're going with this.
Have you ever driven a tractor?
No,
Are you going to come and drive my tractors?
sure.
Good. Okay. Now we're on level. Now, okay. Now we're getting there, because a tractor is a good example, but it's true of a boat as well. It operates on the principle of being on an open throttle. In other words, the tractor doesn't move unless, or the boat doesn't move unless you open up the throttle. And you've
Right.
heard that expression, my
Yes.
boat is working at full throttle. So you've got this almost this contradiction between the throttling that says, I'm suffocating, I'm being debilitated. And then you've got the other kind of throttling that says, but that's what actually gets me to the next stage. And that's what gives me speed
Mm.
and velocity and power and all that. And
Propels you forward.
yeah, anxiety is in fact exactly that. Let's look at it this way. If you woke up in the morning without any anxiety whatsoever, and I want you to be quite literal about this, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So you wake up, no anxiety, you actually wouldn't get anything done. You would just sit there
Mm-hmm.
and your world would just go, blah, diddy, blah, by. A lot of people say, oh, I wish I didn't have any anxiety. Well, that's almost like saying, I wish I didn't have any activity in my life,
Mm-hmm.
because you need a certain amount of anxiety that, in fact, is a stimulus. Actually, technically speaking, and I think you know this well better than I do, but when you do experience anxiety, there are physiological things that happen in your body. You get endorphins and you get what else? I can't remember all the things, adrenaline, and there's something else that starts leaking into your system. And that's what,
Right.
in fact, raises your level of awareness and excitement and motivation and so on. So we need some anxiety. It's a bit like the sand in the oyster.
Mm.
That's where the pearl comes from. So we need that.
Right.
If you want to call it an irritant, I think that's probably
Friction. Yes.
friction. Yeah, friction's a very good word. And the other thing about anxiety at that level is it's almost a synonym for self-worth. It's a synonym for one's ego. It's a synonym for how you feel about yourself. And these are very healthy things in their proper proportions. And there's a technical chart. I haven't got it, but I've seen it. And that is, if you have no anxiety, we've just said, well, you just stay
Mhm.
effectively paralyzed. You don't go anywhere. That's
If you have anxiety or if
no
you don't.
anxiety, no anxiety at all. You just won't go nowhere.
Yeah. I
You
just
just,
think people label it differently. So not
oh,
everybody would label their thoughts in the morning that might
yeah,
propel them to do
yeah,
things or to take action.
exactly,
Some people would label those thoughts as anxiety and other
exactly.
people would not label them as anxiety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which goes back to what you said originally, how incredibly individualistic this business of understanding anxiety is. It's up to you, the individual, to
Mhm.
see it, feel it, know it, and so on. But here's the chart that's really interesting, that if you follow the level of anxiety, we're just going to call it that now.
Okay.
If you have this level of anxiety within you and it motivates you and it gets you into getting things done and getting into your car, going to
Productive mode.
a productive mode, exactly. But what's fascinating is if you track that against your performance and your output, that level of anxiety, as it rises, so goes your level of performance in the earlier stage. Which, if you think about it, makes sense. You wake up in the morning and you brush your teeth. Well, you're not really thinking about a great deal. But once you're in the car commuting to work, you're thinking about everything. Because I mean, your
Mhm.
eyes are on traffic and lights and all that
Right.
stuff. So, but here's the fascinating part. when that level of anxiety rises beyond a certain point, our performance collapses.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. It's like going off the edge of the cliff. And therein lies the risk with anxiety, that it's healthy in the throttling sense of opening us up, but it's very dangerous to us in the throttling sense that it suffocates us. So we have to find out where we are on that scale. And that's what we're going to talk about, the scale.
Agreed. And it's interesting because that level or that anxiety that you're speaking of, where it can be restrictive versus the anxiety you're talking about in terms of being productive and moving you forward, is from an HR perspective, that can manifest in a whole myriad of ways from a work environment perspective. It can lead to manifest into absenteeism. It could be decreased productivity. It could be difficulty concentrating or increased errors. It could be strains on workplace relationships. So it can translate, like you say, into some more restrictive issues rather than from a productive standpoint.
And I think you've raised one very important point there, particularly, and that is the way that anxiety, when it's just say out of control, beyond its, I think that, what do they call it now? The optimum performance range. That all of us has an optimum performance range in our level of anxiety. When we go over that range, that's when we start falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And you've mentioned some very interesting points there. You talk about absenteeism.
Yes.
And I think you and I were talking about, I can't validate this, but I was told this, that the Sloan Kettering Institute many, many years ago did a study on cancer. And their discovery was that there was a direct correlation between the incidence of cancer and anxiety. That as anxiety was evident in somebody's life, so also became their, what would you call it, their openness, their vulnerability. Yeah. Vulnerability to cancer. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, wasn't it? Oh, another Latin expression. You ready?
I'm ready.
You're going to look interested this time?
Always interested.
All right, here it goes. Mens sane corpore sano, healthy mind in a healthy body. And, another thing that's very interesting, and this is really important, when your anxiety level is operating in that maximum performance range or optimum performance range, when you're in that mode, that feeling when you just feel good about yourself and you feel like you can grasp the nettles, you can, traffic lights don't bother you anymore. That kind of, it's a lovely feeling. It's a great,
it is.
In fact, it's a feeling of contentment as distinct from happiness. But what I'm getting at is, when you have that feeling, that is when you start taking some really interesting risks. And by risks, I do not mean, let me see if I can race across the expressway.
Right. Yeah.
I'm talking about in your business life, your personal life, your social, wherever it might be.
This is more open to trying different ideas,
absolutely,
and perspectives without having that fear around it.
Exactly. Well, it does. Yeah. It's a very, very good way of starting to bring down what you might call your fear. And fear is what we want to talk about next. Now, if we've explored the business of anxiety and performance, I think we've beaten up on that subject. So if we could move it up to the next one now, is where does this anxiety come from? We're not talking about the DNA anxiety.
Right. We're leaving that to the right wheelhouse. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. No, this anxiety that we're talking about is, generally speaking, learned. And fascinatingly, I know we all know this, but how much stuff we learn as children that we carry right the way through the rest of our lives. The classic is this. I don't want to trick you on this, but let me try it on you. And that is, if I asked you, in fact, I will ask you, as a student, actually, you've done a lot of academic work, haven't you? You've got just the certificate, not a certificate, but
emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is you understand that world very easily. So if I said to you, how would you grade yourself as a student academically? How would you grade yourself? Let me just come up with a quick answer. What do you think it might be in your case? Are you an
Do you
A?
mean on a scale of
Yeah.
how successful I was or what my engagement level was?
Yeah, but if somebody said to you, you graduated from university or college or something, and somebody says, what sort of grade student were you? You would tend to have a single number or letter that says, in my case,
Fair. You typically would give a percentage, or were you on honor roll? Were you not on honor roll?
yeah, exactly. And then if I said to you, were you an A student or a B or a C or D? Yeah, you come. So just give me what you think you would. We're talking about Sarah's graduated from university. We're now 10 years later or 20 years later. And I say to you, by the way, what sort of grade were you? What sort of academic standing would you give yourself?
I would give myself an A student.
You're an A student.
Mhm.
That explains everything because I'm a B.
It would
So,
depend
okay.
which field of topic,
Yeah,
which
let it be said, let our
course.
listeners hear that, you're A and I'm B. Okay. What's fascinating is for most of us, and I wasn't trying to corner you or trick you,
Yes.
for most of us, if you ask somebody, let's take the average, I don't know, let's say a 50-year-old, and you say to a 50-year-old, how would you rate yourself academically? And they come up with the answer of, let's say, a B or an A or whatever it
Right.
is. Do you realize that that rating, that measurement was formed 30 years ago
Mhm.
and you're still hanging on to it?
Mhm.
So we hang on.
I was
Sorry.
gonna say it's funny because I have a completely different perspective on grades and where you rank
Yeah.
now than I would have ever back then. So, like, the guidance that I give my children
Hmm.
is from this current philosophy versus back then.
Yeah. I know. But labeling yourself or being labeled as a younger person
Mhm.
tends to be a trait that we carry all the way through.
Well, I think that's what the world does. Our
It does.
environments, our
Oh,
social
yes.
environments, our work
Yeah.
environment, everything is a label
Yeah.
on your
Yeah.
performance, how well you do, what grade did you get,
Yeah.
where did you rank,
Yeah.
right?
And Respectonomics says nuts to that. What we want to do is to give people an understanding of their potential, give them the tools to reach that potential,
Mhm.
and more than anything else, to restore and to rebuild their own dignity.
It's about yourself and not comparing yourself
Absolutely.
to others,
Mhm.
right?
By the way, I just mentioned the word restore, which, as you know, is the cornerstone to Respectonomics, restoring our
Yes,
dignity.
yes.
And I did do one little bit of analysis of the word restore. And it really, really hits a home run, this one,
Mm,
because restore is made up of two words, rest and awe. And the rest part of it is absolutely crucial to bringing levels of anxiety into an appropriate range. Most of us today do not rest properly. Rest
agreed.
is, it's an activity. It's a curious thing. People will say, I'm going to rest, I'm going to relax, and they go and sit in front of the TV. Well, you and I know, go watch YouTube for a couple of hours. That ain't resting. It's actually very dulling. I think
Yeah,
there's some scientific stuff that's going on that's not very healthy, but it is not in and of itself restful. Resting is an activity. So when
I
we,
also
sorry,
I was just gonna say, I also think in different countries, different cultures,
Mhm.
rest means something completely different, or there's a positive or negative connotation to it as well. I think in where we are, your value or what you are contributing is based upon how many hours you're putting in, how
Yeah,
hard you're working, what you're
exactly.
giving up versus a
Yeah.
balance, right?
Yeah, well, we talked about this in one of our previous chats, which was this
Mhm,
whole business about you're spending some time in reflection, you're taking some time
mhm,
for yourself, and you're
yeah,
sitting quietly doing that. And somebody comes up and says, what are you doing?
mhm.
And it's not said, what are you doing in a generous way? It is said actually critically, what are you doing?
Yes.
Like
I
there's
think there's a
something wrong.
blanket statement out there that, yes, we should rest and we should restore,
Yeah,
yet I still think there's some guilty
mhm,
feelings attached to that when you
absolutely.
actually attempt to do that, right?
Mhm. And we're made to feel that way.
Yes.
That comment you just made in the corporate world of productivity and output and all this kind of stuff, and that proverbial boss. supervisor who's
Mm.
sort of always looking and saying, "What are you doing now?" And you feel, I think you said earlier, how guilty you can feel not doing something.
Yes.
I mean, guilt
Yes.
and anxiety, I mean, they have a wonderful way of breeding into each other.
Yes.
So, but I want to say one more thing about the word restore. We've talked a bit
Hmm.
about the importance of rest and the all part of it, the ORE. I think that defines the all body that is within each and every one of us. And there's an ore body of huge value within each of us. We talk about, somebody's a mining and they say they found an ore body of gold. Well, I think that ore body of gold exists within the human being.
Mm.
But if you don't rest, it's very hard to find it. And it's certainly very difficult to extract it.
Right.
So this is why I think this business of anxiety, identifying it, confronting it, bringing it under control is so important.
So, would you mind sharing, and entirely up to you,
Mhm.
would you mind sharing, for example, because as we talked about, anxiety is very individualistic,
Right.
and what may prompt anxiety for one person would not prompt
Ex-
anxiety for
Very
another.
fair.
So, are you open to sharing, for example, something that either in the past or current that would cause you anxiety and how you were made aware it was causing you anxiety and how you address it?
I don't want to do that.
Okay, well, you don't have to.
And I can hear you saying, "Oh, yes, you will." I think that bringing your anxiety under control, and I'll call it under control, but bringing it into balance
Mhm.
actually allows one to talk about what creates one's anxiety.
Mm.
I'm big. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, of course, it's a personal decision whether I talk about it or not, but it's authentic. And it's
Mhm.
much easier to talk about those issues once one's got one's anxiety and that place of under control. It's
Right.
under control. It's fun to talk. It in fact is almost funny to talk about the things that have created these levels of anxiety. In my own case, I have two sort of easy ones. One is at school,
Mhm.
I had, I was, in British terminology, I was an unpopular schoolboy.
And why is that? Or
because
do you
I
wanna
because I didn't fit in. I wasn't in that sort of the world where you sort of talked about, I don't know, jazz, girls, all of those kinds of things. It just wasn't my world. My
Right.
world was, if you can believe it, was and still is, in fact, chainsaws, tractors, jeeps, and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
That's where, in fact, I that's my alter ego. That's where I
Right.
get
We've
my
talked
jolly.
about that way
Yeah,
back at the onset. Yes.
yeah. Yeah. And not only that, I had very poor control of the English language and I could get upset very easily. So this is where we get to the nub of the matter, because when you have those experiences, in my case,
Mhm.
being unpopular, not able to speak clearly, etc., when you get into that, it hurts. And you're
Mhm.
not stupid. When you're hurt, you avoid being hurt. I mean,
Mhm.
you don't crazily go out and stand in the middle of the school and or wherever it is, the boardroom, and say, you know something, I am hopeless at speaking or I am hopeless at something. You tend not to do that because it brings out all of those things that create pain. In
Mm.
other words, our behavior is modified by our emotions. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so what we do is we then create these brilliant schemes to avoid those kinds of confrontation. So, in other words, I make sure that I'm not in a setting where somebody is going to laugh at me, which can mean lots of different things of the way
Right.
that I become that avoider. But it's very easy to use avoidance as a way of saying, I don't want to get hurt. I
Mhm.
mean, the classic example of that is the person who has, in fact, I'm terrified. No, the picture can't see my desk, can it?
No, it cannot.
Good. Good. Well, here's a little example. My desk is a mess. It really is. It's awful. I keep throwing things on it and knowing I'll get back to them later. Ha ha ha. But anyway, there's that. And then, of course, every now and again, I'll say, gosh, I really must tidy up my desk. And I do. So I
Hmm.
put it all into its proper files and folders and all that. But the interesting thing is taking that kind of action does not explain, doesn't work with, doesn't solve any of my other fears. For example, the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of looking stupid. So, in
Hmm.
other words, we do things that we think are going to solve another problem. They don't do it at all. So, in other words,
Perhaps we're just moving it around,
oh, moving it around is exactly right.
recategorizing.
Mm-hmm. 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 That's why when you talk to a salesperson and they've got a list of prospecting cards in their hands, they're going to be calling these 10 people that day.
Hmm.
And the classic is they look at the top name and say, I don't think so, thank you. And they put that card at the bottom of the pile. And then they get their desk nice and messy, and they were very busy all day, and they never got a chance to call that individual.
Mm.
The real decision was, I don't want to call him because I'm
Right,
experiencing some kind of fear that translates into a memory of pain that I want to avoid. So
right.
what we need to do here is, I believe, is we've talked about anxiety. We're talking about how does it get into our lives. You asked me about my background and
Hmm.
so on. And there are sort of three or four dimensions to those memories. There's fear of failure.
Hmm.
Do you remember? Well, I'll go through them first. There's fear of failure. There's fear of rejection, which is
Hmm.
probably uppermost in most people's lives, frankly. So you've got fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of success, which is a
Hmm.
really curious animal. Fear of success actually is a Jeremy. I experience it. I'll do extremely well. And then once I've completed that task, I look up and say, well, I'll never be able to do that again.
Hmm.
Guess what? I prove it to myself and I don't do it again. And I go thundering down into some trough. Then I got to rebuild it back up again. Fear of success is, by the way, where people they get great guilt. They can do extremely well and they feel guilty that they've done so well because their parents didn't do well, their brothers or
Hmm.
sisters didn't do well. So there's a sense of guilt of, I'm not sure how this happened, instead of celebrating.
Right. Or they're just afraid of how their life will change or how
Yeah.
it will look
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And the other one is the fear of looking foolish.
Mm.
I mean, and that I mean, I can attest to that one because it goes back into my school experiences and other experiences where I looked foolish. And you avoid situations where you're going to look foolish. And
Hmm.
there's one other which is kind of interesting. It's called situational shyness. And this is very much in the sales world. You experience this. In situational shyness, what happens is I can do it under one set of circumstances, but not on another.
Mm. Okay.
The classic example of that is I can pick up the phone and call anybody, but I'm at a cocktail party. No way I'm going to go and talk to a stranger,
Okay.
or vice versa.
So it's environmental.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah. So what we're dealing with is we've identified each of us has these different fears that, by the way, will influence us at different levels, different times, different degrees of
Hmm.
intensity. There's no one line answer to them. But being aware of these fears of, as I say, fear of rejection, fear of looking foolish, understanding these fears exist. There's one comment I want to make. We're all the same.
Hmm.
This is not
Well,
unique to Sarah and Jeremy. This
mhm.
is everywhere.
Well, I think when you identify that you're aware of it or that you're experiencing anxiety, and you can get to the place where you're very well aware that you're experiencing anxiety, it's then that you can start to, and not everybody can do this, and that's okay,
Mm.
but then you can start to look to, okay, how do I address that? What are the tools and resources that I
Ah,
have that can help me address now that I'm aware that I'm
yeah,
feeling anxious?
yeah.
What are the tools and resources that are available to help us navigate that,
Should
right?
we talk? Should we talk about those?
I think we should
Because
open your toolbox, Jeremy.
I'm going to show you the toolbox right now. But before we do that, one thing that's interesting is we both agreed, and I think all of us will agree, that anxiety is self-measuring itself. It's subjective. You have your
Yeah.
level of,
Yeah.
call it discomfort. I have my level of discomfort. Interestingly, you and I could look at each other and say, well, that bothers you?
Hmm.
You'd look at me and say, Jeremy, that bothers you? Yeah, we have different strokes for different folks. No
Yes,
point.
I think it's about too being mindful of not being judgmental
Mhm.
with others in terms of what causes them
Exactly.
anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a particular instance, I'm not going to call out who or what the circumstance was. However, somebody had identified that they had anxiety,
Uh
and the response that was provided to them was that it's in your head.
huh.
And so
Seriously?
And so again, anxiety is very individualistic to all of
Absolutely.
us, levels, intensity, what that scenario is. However, when you're identifying or having the courage to share that you're having anxiety about
Mm,
something, and then to have someone or particular group or whatever the case may be say to you, it's in your head, you're then not validated for what you've just
exactly.
shared, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
a
I
It's
agree
not
with
a
you.
great
No, I
thing.
agree. The principle behind respectonomics, we've talked about this and will talk about it, I think, probably forever. And that is, it's a parallel construction that allows us to draw alongside somebody else,
Mhm.
not be under them, over them, or at them, the way you've just described it.
Right.
It's in your head. No, draw alongside and say,
Mm.
hey, tell me,
Compassion, empathy,
yeah,
understanding.
tell me about it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and just tell me about it. So, but one thing I want to emphasize here is this: there is one almost a clinical aspect to it, though, and that is if you're going to talk about anxiety, and I'm going to talk about anxiety, and we both agree it's individualistic, it's subjective, and so on. It's also useful to develop a measuring tool. In other words, each of us needs to have that awareness that we experience anxiety. We do. But we need to have a tool within ourselves to find out where am I at the moment. My level of anxiety as I speak with you this morning, I'm going to suggest, and I'd be interested in your answer to this. I reckon I am talking with you now in my maximum performance range, meaning I reckon my anxiety level now is working exactly where it ought to be. I'm working, I'm comfortable with my subject, I'm comfortable with you, I'm comfortable with the objectives and the aspirations of respectonomics. It's all coming together. So, in other words, what you could say to me is, Jeremy, how would you measure your level of anxiety at the moment? What are your telltale signs? It might be the way I hold my hands. It might be the way that I blink. It might be the way that I salivate. I mean, it can be all kinds of things in your physiology. But whatever
Right.
it is, pay attention to those measuring tools because we all have them. You
Mhm.
asked me at the beginning, how do you know when you're anxious? Well, and I said, well, sometimes you get sweaty palms or something.
Right.
But
And maybe what might help people starting to identify is when they notice that they're feeling anxious, is to perhaps start writing down some of the emotions or some of the external environmental things that are happening or what's going through their mind at the time to help them go back
that
and
it that isn't fair. You have just stolen my thunder.
It was unintentional, that's for sure.
I think most of the world would love you to steal my thunder. But no, seriously, I think looking then at the toolbox,
Mhm,
because I think the first thing is like anything, if you're a carpenter or a mechanic, or I mean, you're in the design world and you understand these things, a lot of what you do, and in your real estate activities, a lot of what you do is measuring. You're measuring, from the standpoint of, will this residence be big enough, small enough, whatever it is. We measure a lot of things in life.
mhm,
So measuring your own level of anxiety is totally logical, rational. And I think we should do that and
right.
look for the signs and the signals of when I'm up and down and sideways and so on. Now, with that in mind, I want to take us to two parts of this puzzle. What do I do when my level of anxiety is too low? In other words, I do not have that sense of motivation. I don't have that sense of getting up and going.
Mhm.
Do you ever have that feeling? Ever, 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 ever,
To feel
ever.
unmotivated?
Mm-hmm. Ever.
Or of course.
Same here. My point is, when we are not feeling motivated, one of the, and I think you know this for a lot of reasons, one of the keys to bringing up your level of anxiety, and bringing it up meaning bringing it to where it performs for you.
Hmm.
Are you with me on that? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. To bring it up. But at the same time, when your level of anxiety is too high and you want to bring it down,
Hmm.
which sounds almost like a contradiction. One says up, one says down. But it's interesting. One of the techniques that works at both ends of that spectrum is physical aerobic exercise.
Mm.
Just physically, it's very, very hard. And you know this because you do a lot of workout and so on. But when you're doing that, and I do a lot of physical stuff on in the farm. But
Yes.
when you're being very physical in that sense, it is extraordinary how it brings down your level of anxiety or raises up your sense of motivation.
Hmm.
One of the most fascinating things is when you feel completely, out of it. It is interesting what happens if you put on a pair of running shoes and go for it.
Right.
And nothing, I mean, it sounds awful because you actually have to do it and it's an
Well, it could
effort.
be anything. It could just be going
Yeah.
outside for a while. It doesn't have to be something intense, right? Just the
No, it doesn't
physical
have to be intense.
of
But actually, Sarah, there's one thing that's statistically important, and that is to raise the level of your
elevate your
heart.
heart rate. Yes.
Yeah. So the aerobic part of it, I wouldn't call that intense. But in other
Right.
words, if you're going to go for a walk, the way you've just said,
Brisk activity.
make it a brisker walk than usual. And when you do that, you see, you're being conscious. You're saying, I'm going to walk faster than usual. And when you
Hmm.
start doing that, that again takes your attention away from the anxiety and puts it into how your calf muscles feel, your ankles
Yeah. Well, it
feel.
releases endorphins as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brings us back. And if you've got too much in the system, it's a great way of bringing it down again. So
Right.
exercise is key. Now, I said a moment ago that you had stolen my thunder
I
because you
yes.
talked about writing. In this case, you talked about writing emotions. Interestingly, actually, you can write regardless of what you write about. And the classic example of that is that if you go out for a nice meal and you write a thank you letter to somebody, thank you for having me around and all that stuff. Curious thing about that is when you write the letter, how wonderful you feel about yourself. You may have
Mm.
noticed that when you've written the letter, you will actually reread it to yourself 5 times.
Right.
And then when you've finished reading it to yourself 5 times, you will accidentally show it to other people and say, oh, this is what I wrote to Sarah. And you show people what you've written. Writing is a very, very powerful tool. And if I'm going to be critical of, we try not to be critical in Respectonomics, but I am very critical of the educational system that has basically thrown handwriting to the wolves. That is a huge, huge mistake. Writing is a powerful antidote. And if we use it even more in terms of anxiety, it turns us almost into guided missiles. Let me
Mm.
explain. When you're writing, your brain is what, roughly speaking, divided into two hemispheres. Roughly speaking, I think if you look at it on one of those ghastly biology pictures, you see what looks like a left side and a right side. And we talk about left and right side of brain. But the interesting is you cannot be on both sides at the same time.
Mm.
Physically impossible. And therefore, when you're writing, that is physically what puts you into the productive side of your brain.
Mm.
It's where
Okay.
you do your creativity. It's where you find your enjoyment. A lot of things happen when you're in the right side of your brain. The left side is the one, or the other, whichever it is the one that remembers all the pains and agonies and the anxieties and the hurts in your life. So just picking up a pen and writing a letter is very powerful, but taking that to its logical, rational conclusion, think what happens if you turn that into a practice of writing a journal.
Mm.
Writing a journal not only takes us from left to right, but
Right.
people will tell you, and it's certainly true in my life, this is authentic. When I write a journal, I am utterly amazed at the ideas, the thoughts, the expressions that come out. I
Mm.
look at them and thinking, where on the earth did that come from?
Where did that come from?
Yeah. And Respectonomics, by the way, is a classic example of this because it all started with my writing a book. And when I started writing the book started writing me.
Mm,
And that became the footings or the foundation to respectonomics.
right.
So it's a very, very self-discovering, building up tool to be writing, and biologically, physiologically, very, very healthy. I'll give you one more example. Have you ever stayed in a, I don't know, motel, hotel, restaurant or something, and you've had a terrible experience? Food was awful, the service was awful, something was awful. Yeah. And you get one of those pieces of paper out of their desk drawer which says, "We would like your comments." You know the thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you write on it. This is the worst motel I have ever been to. The bathroom was filthy, the windows were dirty, the noise was this, the door didn't close properly, blah, blah, blah. And you write all these things and you've got it right down to the T. Yeah.
Yes.
You write all this down. What, in fact, statistically, classically, what do you do with that piece of paper, that letter note when you've written it? What do you actually do with it?
I bet you it gets tossed out.
It does. Very important point. So if we could toss out our anxiety, that's a pretty healthy way to be dealing with it. And the wonderful thing about the journal is it allows you to deal with it. The person who deals with you the best is you. The person who deals with me the best is me. And writing and doing a journal is one of the easiest tools to doing it. So we've covered off two bases, really. One is the exercise issue, and the other one is writing. Do you want any
Anything
more?
else in your toolkit?
Could be. Could be. There is one more, and that is one of the things that most of us are very familiar with is what I call being subject to a contract. And by that, a contract, I mean, for example, if you go and borrow $100 from the bank, you may
Mhm.
not remember this, but when you borrow the $100 from the bank actually makes you sign something. It's incredibly rude. It says, "I promise to
Hey,
pay you back," you know, and I mean, I don't suppose you've ever done this, but it'd be fun to stand in front of the bank manager or whoever it is and say, "What? Is my word not good enough?" And the bank will always say, "Actually,
oh,
Jeremy, no." So we need to they ask us to write a contract, or they give us the contract that we sign off on. And it's a very useful technique to write contracts with yourself. Now, if you're going to write a contract with yourself, this is to do with something that is immediately under your control. It's not one of these ghastly contracts. I mean, we do goal setting and we say that in 5 years' time, we want to be enormously wealthy. We want to have two Falcon jets and we want to have a house in, I don't know, St. Lucia.
Tuscany.
All right, Tuscany. That's a better one. I said St. Lucia. Tuscany is better.
I take one there too.
No, I know, but I would too, particularly in this winter. But isn't it interesting, though, that when you do those sort of long range goal things, they're
Mm-hmm.
okay. They've got great, there's a certain character to them, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't help you to overcome the immediacy of what you've got to deal with.
No,
So
no.
a contract is a very useful tool to say, and dividing it into two parts of your life. There's the physicality, the exercise and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the doing of what you should be doing. You've been on my case, you and Johan, our producer. You have both been on my case to get my information onto LinkedIn, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now don't, you see, now you just put me down and I can't handle it. But it's true. But the answer is what I need to do, and actually am doing, is to write a contract to myself that
Hmm.
says I commit to doing one page, one introduction, whatever it is, for LinkedIn. Now, here's the catch. When you write a contract with yourself, whether it's physical, I'm going to go running every day, whatever you'll go to the gym,
Right.
or whether I'm going to write the introduction, whatever it is I'm doing. The most important thing is to literally give yourself leeway. So you don't say, I'm going to do this every day. You say 4 out of 7 days, I'm going to do it.
Right.
Now, it's very important because how many times have you found, and I know you and I have had this experience with respectonomics of bringing it forward, there are times when we just haven't been able to get at it.
Yes. So
And
set realistic goals
well,
that are setting you up for success,
and spontaneous,
which keeps
immediate.
momentum.
Absolutely. Because when I do something, I think is it I forget, it's Pavlovian, I think, that when you do something and you successfully,
Positioning.
yeah, you're more likely to do it again.
Hmm.
So what you want to do in your contracts is have a minimum standard. So I contract to do the introduction for LinkedIn over the next 4 out of 7 days. And
Right.
when there's a day that I can't do it, there's nothing lost.
No.
Nothing wrong
Provide
with that.
yourself some grace as well, right?
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
actually, you know this, when people set these unrealistic targets, and I think you're very familiar with that world, when they're
Yeah.
when they're unreasonable, what happens is I'm going to go running every day. Well, of course, the day comes when I can't for whatever reason. Well, that was a stupid idea. I'm not going to do that anymore.
Or I failed.
I failed. I mean, it's all the negatories come tumbling out. So
Yeah.
it's far, far better to give yourself initial leeway. So physical and performance or whatever your activity is, sales, in my case, respectonomics. So you divide those two, number one. Number two, they have to have flexibility in them. So that's where the 4 out of 7 days. And by the
Mhm.
way, 4 out of 7 days doesn't mean to say I can't do it 7 out of 7 days.
Right.
If I want to do that,
Right.
that's fine.
Bonus.
Bonus. But the 4 days is my minimum
Yes.
dosage. But here's the other thing that's really, really important. If I meet what I said I was going to do, so in other words, I've said I'm going to do the paragraph you want me to do for LinkedIn. I owe myself a reward. Give myself a reward. And it does not have to be a big one. It doesn't have to be the villa in Tuscany. As a matter of fact, it's better if it's something really rather small. It might be an outfit that you've always wanted to get. It might be a piece of equipment you want, hardware or something, but something that gives you pleasure.
Right.
In fact, it could be, I will go and have another cup of coffee. But
Right.
think about the little things, and I call them little. These are not big, multi-dimensional, multi-money deals. These are issues where, yeah, I'd like to have a cup of coffee. I'd like to go for a walk. I'd like to go and chat with a friend, all of these things. But those become rewards. And what's important for us all to do is to start thinking about those little things that are,
Hmm.
in fact, pleasurable, that constitute rewards. Because the more you do that and the more you bring those rewards to your contracts, the more likely the contracts are to be fulfilled. And
Right.
also, that means you've taken this wonderful sense of being in control of your anxiety and so on, but now you're putting yourself to work. It's brilliant.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I think that sums up very nicely.
I've got one more thing.
You do.
I do. Am I allowed one more?
You're allowed one more.
Okay, this came out of a yoga class I heard recently. And at the end of you do yoga, I think. Yeah.
No, actually, I don't.
Oh, I thought you did. Okay. Well,
Mm.
this lady had a yoga class and she just went,
Yoga actually causes me stress.
what's the reason for that?
It actually hurts my body.
Oh,
So
okay.
if it's meditative, I'm fine.
Fine.
But
Yeah.
if you think about it, well, for me anyway, so just sharing a personal, I guess if you want to call it an anxiety,
Yeah.
being in a yoga class, one measuring myself against other people that are in there that do it very well, and I do not because I physically cannot with
Right.
arthritis that I've got. So I can't
Right.
hold positions or with my back.
Interesting.
So I don't feel like I fit in. I don't feel successful in it. So for me, in that type of environment, it is not comfortable for me and doesn't provide me with the peace I think that it provides money.
That's very interesting. And there is an example of from the stand
Individualistic.
individualistic, exactly. And it's not and what you need me to do is to draw alongside you and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had an arthritic issue, which I actually, as a single word, I didn't know you did.
Yes.
I know you talked about some other issues, but I hadn't heard that word either. Now, here's the point. Maybe you have told me and I hadn't heard it. That's quite possible. But
I don't
what
think so, but
but
anyhow.
either way, but this is why the railway track of drawing alongside other people is so important.
Mhm.
And what is good for you is good for you. What's good for me is good for me.
Right.
And maybe ne'er the twain shall meet. I don't know.
Right.
But I wanted to tell you about the yoga comment
Yes.
that at the end of the yoga class, the instructor, everybody was resting, relaxing, whatever they say. And she said, now, she said, before you get up or move on, I want you to all give yourselves a smile.
Mm.
And I thought that was very interesting because you know how you're in a grumpy mood and somebody says, why don't you smile? Why don't you smile at the world? The world likes smiles. If you smile,
Mm.
the world smiles
Yeah.
with you. Well, these are all not bad home truths, except for one thing. If you ain't smiling at yourself, that is not a happy place. So
No.
smiling at yourself is a wonderful, wonderful remembrance. If out of all of what we've talked about, if people, as far as their dignity is concerned, as far
Mhm.
as their motivation is concerned, if they were just, I included, if we just smiled at ourselves, that smile is infectious because I now feel better about myself.
Mm.
And if I feel better about myself, far better chance I'll be able to help other people feel better about themselves.
Right. Or even just raise awareness of
Oh,
others.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So, do we get to our time honored sign off?
We do with a smile.
Yeah, I didn't mean a cheesy smile. I meant a smile.
Mine wasn't cheesy. I don't know why.
No, but it is
Mine
fun to
was
smile.
authentic.
Yeah, but it's smiling at yourself is the key.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. That's the important. I think that what she said, the instructor said, is it would be a huge, almost to the world. Would you please
Mhm.
smile at yourself?
Yes. Be kind
Yeah,
to yourself.
kind to yourself. Exactly.
Mhm.
So for our standard sign off, yes,
Yes.
we
Rest.
star case. No, together. Say it so everybody can hear it.
Yes,
We
sir.
rest our
We
case.
rest our case.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jeremy.